In the heart of Lagos, where the streets buzzed with life, there lived a man named Donald. Donald was no ordinary man. He was a billionaire. His wealth sparkled like gold dust, drawing people to him like moths to a flame. With a fleet of luxury cars, a mansion that seemed to touch the sky, and servants who answered his every call, Donald was the man every young boy in the neighborhood dreamed of becoming. But Donald had a flaw, one so deep it blinded him to his own shadow. He believed women were playthings, disposable treasures for his amusement. They came into his life as quickly as they left, each one treated with less care than the last. To Donald, women were like toys, there for pleasure, discarded without thought. One day, during a lavish party at his mansion, Donald met Ada, a beautiful young woman with a fiery spirit. She wasn't like the others who swooned over his wealth. Ada's beauty wasn't just in her face but in her boldness. When Donald approached her with his usual charm, she simply smiled and said, "Your money may buy many things, but not my respect." Donald was stunned. No one had ever spoken to him like that before. He laughed it off, but her words clung to him like an old curse. That night he made a vow. "I'll make her mine," he said, his pride wounded. Days turned into weeks as Donald tried to win Ada's heart. He sent her flowers, jewels, and even offered to build a school in her name. But Ada was unmoved. "You cannot buy love, Donald," she told him. Frustrated, Donald decided to play his cruel game. He spread rumors about Ada, hoping to tarnish her reputation. "If I can't have her," he told himself, "no one else will." But the more he tried to destroy her, the stronger Ada seemed to grow. One evening, as the sun dipped into the horizon, Donald received a strange visitor. An old woman with silver hair and piercing eyes stood at his gate. "I have a message for you, Donald," she said in a voice that sent chills down his spine. "What message?" he asked, dismissing her as just another beggar. "You think you're untouchable," she said, "but every seed you sow will grow, and some seeds bear thorns." Donald laughed, waving her off. "Old woman, go back to your village with your riddles." The woman smiled, her gaze never leaving his. "We shall see, Donald. We shall see." That night, as he lay in his bed, Donald began to dream. But it wasn't an ordinary dream. It was a nightmare so vivid it felt real. In it, he stood in a field of gold, surrounded by all the women he had wronged. Their voices echoed, each one crying out for justice. The field turned dark, and the gold melted into a river of blood. Donald woke up drenched in sweat, his heart racing. He laughed nervously, trying to shake off the terror. "It's just a dream," he told himself. But deep down, he felt a crack in his confidence. The next day, strange things began to happen. Donald's businesses faced sudden losses, his cars broke down without reason, and his trusted friends started to turn against him. It was as if the world had conspired to bring him to his knees. And then one evening, he saw her, the old woman from his gate. She stood in the corner of his lavish living room, her eyes filled with sorrow and wisdom. "The price is always greater, Donald," she said. He froze, unable to speak. What was happening? Was this punishment for his arrogance? Or was it something far darker? Donald stared at the old woman, his mind spinning. He blinked, hoping she would vanish like a shadow in the night, but she remained, solid and unyielding. Her presence filled the room with an eerie silence. "Who are you?" Donald asked, his voice trembling despite himself. "I am a messenger," she said calmly. "A reflection of the choices you've made." Donald clenched his fists, anger bubbling under his fear. "I don't know what you're talking about. Leave my house before I call security." The old woman chuckled softly, the sound chilling. "Do you think your wealth can protect you from what's coming?" she asked, stepping closer. "The lives you've broken, the hearts you've trampled, they're rising against you, and their cries are louder than your money." Donald's chest tightened. "I've done nothing wrong," he said defensively. "Nothing wrong." The woman raised an eyebrow, her voice suddenly louder. "What about Nkem, the girl who trusted you only for you to ruin her name? What about Ifeoma, who you left to fend for herself when she carried your child? Shall I name more?" Donald took a step back, his legs trembling. "How do you know these things?" The woman leaned in, her face inches from his. "I know because the spirits have seen it all. You were warned, but you chose to laugh. Now you will reap what you have sown." Before Donald could respond, she was gone. One blink, and the room was empty again. The air was heavy, the silence deafening. For the first time in his life, Donald felt helpless. He poured himself a glass of water, his hands shaking so much that the glass slipped and shattered on the floor. "It's all in my head," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Just a bad dream. Nothing more." But it wasn't over. The next morning, Donald woke up to chaos. His phone buzzed with frantic calls from his managers. His largest business deal had collapsed overnight, leaving him with millions in losses. Worse, his bank accounts were frozen due to a mysterious legal issue. "How can this be happening?" he shouted into the phone. "Fix it. Do you hear me? Fix it." But no one could fix it. His empire, built on pride and arrogance, was crumbling before his eyes. Later that day, as Donald drove through the city to clear his mind, he noticed something strange. Everywhere he went, he saw women with familiar faces. They were watching him, their eyes filled with an unspoken sadness. Some looked like the women he had hurt, others like shadows of memories he had long buried. "Stop staring at me," he yelled out loud, slamming his fist on the steering wheel. But the faces didn't disappear. By nightfall, Donald locked himself in his mansion, the once grand building now feeling like a prison. The voices started again, soft whispers that grew louder with each passing moment. "You think you're untouchable, Donald," the voices said, "but justice sees all." Donald covered his ears, but the voices only grew louder. His reflection in the mirror began to change. Instead of his confident, handsome face, he saw a hollow version of himself, eyes sunken, face pale, his wealth and pride stripped away. "No!" he screamed, throwing a vase at the mirror. It shattered, but the image didn't leave his mind. Exhausted, he fell to the floor, tears streaming down his face. "What do you want from me?" he cried out to the empty room. The answer came, not in words, but in a vision. A long road stretched before him, lined with the faces of the women he had wronged. At the end of the road stood Ada, her gaze steady and piercing. "You must make amends, Donald," the voices said. "Only then will the curse be lifted." Donald's heart sank. Could he face the truth? Could he undo the damage he had caused? Or was it too late? The vision faded, leaving Donald alone in the darkness of his mansion. The silence pressed against him like a weight. For the first time in his life, he felt small, smaller than the poorest beggar on the streets of Lagos. Donald spent the night tossing and turning, haunted by the faces of the women he had wronged. Their voices echoed in his mind, each one telling a story of betrayal, pain, and shattered trust. He couldn't sleep, couldn't think, couldn't escape. By dawn, he made a decision. If the only way to end this torment was to make amends, then so be it. He didn't know where to begin, but he knew he had to start somewhere. The first name that came to his mind was Nkem. She had been a young, ambitious woman with dreams of opening her own fashion store. Donald had promised to fund her dream in exchange for her love. But when she refused to let him control her life, he humiliated her in front of her family and left her penniless. Donald called his assistant to track her down. It didn't take long to find her. Nkem was working as a seamstress in a small shop on the outskirts of a city. When Donald arrived, the shop was quiet. Nkem sat at a sewing machine, her back straight, her hands steady as she stitched a vibrant Ankara dress. She didn't notice him at first. "Nkem," Donald said softly, his voice breaking the stillness. She looked up, her eyes widening in shock. "Donald," she said, her tone a mix of surprise and bitterness. "What are you doing here?" Donald hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "I came to apologize," he said finally. Nkem laughed, a short, harsh sound. "Apologize? After all these years? Do you think words can erase what you did to me?" "I know they can't," Donald said, his voice heavy with regret. "But I need to try. I was wrong, Nkem. I was selfish and cruel. I used my power to hurt you, and I'm sorry." Nkem stared at him, her expression unreadable. "Why now, Donald? Why after all this time?" Donald didn't know how to explain the curse, the old woman, the nightmares. So he simply said, "Because it's the right thing to do." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a check. "This won't fix everything, but it's a start," he said, placing it on the table. Nkem glanced at the check, then back at him. "Money won't undo the past, Donald," she said. "But maybe it's a step forward." Her words gave Donald a flicker of hope. He left the shop feeling lighter, as if a small part of the burden had been lifted. But he knew his journey was far from over. Next, he thought of Ifeoma, the woman who had carried his child. He had abandoned her, denying responsibility and leaving her to raise the baby alone. Guilt clawed at him as he recalled the look of heartbreak on her face the last time he saw her. Finding Ifeoma proved harder than he expected. She had moved away, her trail faint and scattered. Donald hired private investigators, determined to track her down. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, the whispers grew louder, the nightmares darker. Finally, he found her in a small village, living in a modest house with her son, his son. The boy, now 6 years old, was playing outside when Donald arrived. The sight of him made Donald's heart ache. He had his eyes, his smile. How had he turned his back on his own flesh and blood? When Ifeoma opened the door and saw him, her face hardened. "What do you want, Donald?" she asked coldly. "I want to make things right," he said, his voice trembling. "I was a coward, Ifeoma. I abandoned you and our child. I can never undo that, but I want to try to be a part of his life if you'll let me." Ifeoma's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. "Do you think you can just walk back into our lives after all these years?" she asked. "No," Donald said. "But I'm here, and I'll do whatever it takes to earn your forgiveness." Ifeoma studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "You have a lot to prove, Donald, and it won't be easy." "I don't expect it to be," he said. As Donald left the village, he felt the weight on his shoulders ease slightly. But the road ahead was still long. The whispers had quieted, but they hadn't disappeared. He knew there were more names to face, more hearts to mend. The question was, would he have the strength to finish what he had started? Days turned into weeks as Donald worked tirelessly to right his wrongs. The once proud billionaire, who had strutted through life without a care, now found himself humbled. Each apology chipped away at his arrogance, leaving behind a man he barely recognized. But the whispers hadn't stopped. They came in the dead of night, soft and haunting. "Not enough, Donald. Not yet." He had one more name on his list. Ada. Ada, the woman who had rejected him. The one whose words had cut deeper than he'd realized at the time. She had been the spark that started his downfall. And now, she was the last person he needed to face. Finding Ada wasn't difficult. She still lived in Lagos, working as a teacher in a community school. Donald had passed the school many times without a second thought, but now, as he approached its worn gates, he felt his stomach twist in knots. The sound of children's laughter filled the air. Donald spotted Ada in the courtyard, surrounded by a group of young students. She was smiling, her joy as radiant as the sun. For a moment, Donald hesitated. How could he face her after everything he had done? Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. "Ada!" he called, his voice steady but soft. She turned, her smile fading as her eyes landed on him. "Donald!" she said, her tone cautious. "What are you doing here?" "I came to apologize," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Not just for how I treated you, but for who I was. I was arrogant, selfish, and cruel. You were right about me, Ada, and I see that now." Ada folded her arms, studying him with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "It took you long enough," she said. Donald nodded. "It did. Too long. But I'm here now, and I'll do whatever it takes to prove I've changed." Ada's gaze softened slightly. "Words are easy, Donald," she said. "Change is hard. Are you really ready to face yourself and the damage you've done?" "I am," Donald said without hesitation. Ada let out a sigh, her expression unreadable. "If you truly mean that, then start by giving back to the people you've taken from. Use your wealth to build, not destroy. And don't do it for me or anyone else. Do it because it's the right thing to do." Donald nodded, her words cutting straight to his heart. "I will," he said. Over the next few months, Donald devoted himself to rebuilding not just his life, but the lives of those he had harmed. He set up scholarships for young women, funded community projects, and opened a shelter for women who had nowhere else to turn. With every act of kindness, the whispers grew fainter, until one night, they stopped altogether. But Donald's journey wasn't over. He continued his work, not because he feared the whispers would return, but because it gave him a sense of purpose he had never known before. One evening, As the sun set over Lagos, Donald stood outside the school where Ada worked. He watched as she helped a group of children with their books, her laughter ringing out like music. She turned and caught his eye, offering him a small smile. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. Donald smiled back, his heart lighter than it had been in years. For the first time in his life, he understood that true wealth wasn't in money or possessions. It was in the connections we make and the lives we touch. And for Donald, it was a lesson worth every price he had paid.